This is Ashley Newby, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, cultural workers, political organizers, and everyone in between in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Black Studies Podcast. Today, we have Dr. Minkah Makalani, who is an associate professor and director of the Center for Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University, with his intellectual interests lying in intellectual history, Black internationalism, political theory, Caribbean independence, Black power, race, racial identity, and artistry. He is the author of In the Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London, 1917 to 1939, and the co-editor of Escape from New York, The New Negro Renaissance Beyond Harlem. He has written articles in Small Acts, Social Text, the South Atlantic Quarterly, Souls, the Journal of African American History, Women, Gender, and Families of Color, The New Yorker, The New York Times, Slate, Ebony, and the Black Perspectives blog for the African American Intellectual History Society. Hi, Dr. Makalani. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the invitation, and happy to be here and join the conversation.
So let's start with how you got into the field of Black studies and what keeps you committed to the field.
Yeah, so what got me into Black studies? It can be a very long, winding story, but I guess I would say that when I got to college, I went to college and went to play football. I wasn't concerned about getting an education per se. I thought it was valuable, but I came from a working class family. I think my grandfather had gone to college to try and dodge the draft, and then a cousin had gone to college, but never finished. So college and what that entailed, academia, wasn't really a part of anything that I had ever encountered or knew. And when I got to college, I just took courses that I was advised to take, courses that interested me. I went to a small Black college, Central State University in Ohio, to play football, and then transferred to the University of Missouri. And I left in the first year. But my political interest had been piqued by that time. This is the late 1980s. So I'd seen Jesse Jackson's two runs for the Democratic nomination for president. The Louis Farrakhan and the Nation of Islam were back on the rise at that point. And while I was out of school, I went to a local bookstore in my neighborhood at the W.E.B. Du Bois Learning Center in Kansas City, Missouri. And, the late 80s, early 90s was this interesting moment, particularly for someone who had no real introduction to academia, no real introduction to scholarship of any sort. You had hip hop, which was, this is really the golden era. So you had a lot of quote unquote conscious rap. Afrocentrism was on the rise. And you also had a number of independent Black bookstores in communities all around. And so these were often, these were often community centers. People would have study groups there. They were nodes of political organizing in various places. So I found myself going to the center just to find books, to try and make sense of the world. And, got introduced to a whole world of scholarship that I wasn't familiar with. So talking about Chancellor Williams, The Destruction of Black Civilization, Sheikh Anta Diop's, I think it's called The African Origins of Civilization, would purchase tapes of Malcolm X speeches and buy the books of Malcolm X speeches, and Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro. And so by the time that I returned to school, I had all these ideas. I had all this intellectual energy, and I really didn't have anywhere, or I didn't know how to focus it. I didn't know what to do with it. I just had questions. I was trying to understand my experiences, my family's experience, the city I grew up in, the world that we were in. And I returned to the University of Missouri and started to take classes that were on Black subjects, any class that I could find. And the good thing about the University of Missouri at that time is that it had a good number of Black faculty who were interested in cultivating the interest of students and student activists. And not only the Black faculty, but a number of the white faculty that we had were actually leftists and progressives. So like David Roediger, Jean Allman, a woman named Susan Porter Benson. These were labor radical African historians who really pushed our ideas and pushed us to go beyond the classroom. But at no point did I understand that, these were all people in history. And so I was gravitating towards history, but I didn't understand the distinction between, say, history and Black studies.
Mhm.
I didn't understand the distinction between, say, sociology or philosophy, political science, and Black studies, because we had all these people from different departments who were teaching in the Black studies program. And also, I would say that, this is a moment where you have Black studies departments. Missouri had a program. It was under the direction of Sundiata Chajua at the time. There were, I think in the early 90s, there were only two places that had a PhD program, and that was Harvard under Henry Louis Gates and then Temple under Molefi Asante. So thinking about Black studies as a discipline really wasn't on the radar. Our disciplines it didn't occur to me that one approached this as, I'm going into this discipline, I'm going to that discipline. I was really concerned about these questions that I had around Black people, our history, our experiences, our ideas, our culture. And so I just took whatever I could get my hands on, whatever classes were offered, I took. And so I was a history major and an English minor. I was a creative writer. I was into poetry. I tried my hand at being a freelance journalist, which didn't pay that well in the Midwest. So I decided to, after leaving school a second time, I decided to go back and focus on getting a PhD. So I had a BA in history and a minor in English, but I think I was really a Black studies scholar without knowing it at that time. And then when I went to graduate school, I actually ended up in a history program as a fallback. I applied to MFA programs in poetry. I was still committed to being a writer. And I did not get admitted to programs that had good funding. And it was the prospect of taking out tens of thousands of dollars in funding to go to get MFA in poetry or get a degree in history. And so sometimes I regret that decision, but that's how I ended up in a master's program. And this again, Sundiata Chajua was at the University of Missouri. He had gone to Southern Illinois University by this point. And so I went to study with him for my master's. And then I ended up at the University of Illinois for my PhD program. And it was an interesting place. It's much different than it is now. I think by this point, your alma mater, Michigan State, had a growing graduate focus on the African diaspora. There were other programs. I still wasn't really well versed, so I ended up in terms of what graduate programs offered. And so I went to Illinois, and the bad thing about Illinois at the time was that it didn't really have a strong focus in African American history. There was no attention to the African diaspora. And at a certain point, I felt like I was putting a program together with tape and hope. And the upside of that was it allowed me to continue to explore my interests wherever they took me. So if I took classes with an African study scholar in sociology, Zini Magabani, I took courses. I took independent reading courses with philosophers. I took anything I could get my hands on that would still feed my interest. And by the time I graduated, I think I was really well versed in the methodology of history. I knew how to do historical research. But I remember my first year in a job at Rutgers University in the history department, which was amazing at that time. But I was terrified that someone would ask me, so what do historians do? Because I couldn't answer the question at the time. I had no idea. I think I spent the first year on that job trying to make sense of what historians did to be able to articulate it. So I knew how to do archival research, but I didn't know what historians did or what was the approach that one took as a historian. But I knew what Black Studies scholars did. I knew that I was guided by the questions that I had, by the concerns or the issue that I wanted to explore. And for me, it was drawing on whatever I needed to do that. And so that made for some bumps in the road along the way. But I think not having a clear sense of what academia was, not having an orientation or kind of a fundamental commitment to the discipline of history or any discipline, and really coming out of this moment where the people with the best ideas that I saw as I entered college were not in the university. They were in communities. They were organizers. And, again, in terms of thinking about that early 90s period, this is a period where if you had an idea, you had to be able to defend it, and you had to read widely to be able to defend it. And if you were in Black organizing spaces, you had to both have the scholarly academic material under your control, and then you had to have the stuff that was read in the community center. So you had to know the Afrocentric material. You had to know the nationalist material. You had to know the stuff that was produced during Black Power, that was produced in Black intellectual organizations. So, I read Carter G. Woodson. I had no idea that he had founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. I had no clue, right? But I think that moment and those circumstances, and really not being aware that one should do this, one should approach academia from a disciplinary perspective, allowed me to just roam freely intellectually. And I think that ended up being the best thing for me, because it actually, I think, helped make me and prepare me to be who I am now.
Thank you. That was really interesting. There were a lot of things that you said about, one, like the types of literature and scholarship and community that you were engaging and cultivating in, that's so reflective of not just a lot of individual journeys into Black studies, but the founding and the foundations of Black studies, period. And right. Even when, particularly in the late 80s and early 90s, when they're just starting to have these PhD programs, you are professors don't have degrees in Black studies yet. That's not a thing. And so having all of these varying disciplinary perspectives that are centered on the study and the upliftment of Black life is a really interesting way to be able to come to that and cultivate your own navigation through it. So,
right. And I would say too, one of those communities that I didn't mention, but being interested in poetry, this was also a moment where there's a very vibrant Black poetry scene that was really based on the East Coast. So from Washington, D.C. on up to New York and Boston. So anthologies were coming out here and there. I think a big one that I remember waiting for was In the Tradition, which was edited by Ross Baraka and I think Kevin Powell. And it had a lot of young Black writers in that. I was in a collection called Testimony, edited by a woman, Natasha Tarpley. And that introduced me to a number of people who, we were all around the same age. So when, the PhD program at Harvard and Temple came on, these were topics of discussion among these writers. And we would talk about the material. And this, a lot of people who may not be readily recognizable, but two names that people will recognize are Jelani Cobb and Ta-Nehisi Coates. He was much younger, not much, but he's a few years younger than me. And I remember going to DC to hang out with them, and we would be at cafes and we would debate these ideas one-on-one. So there was this sense that these ideas were available. These works were available, and we could develop one another by pushing each other, pushing our own ideas in the same way that we pushed our writing, that we pushed one another's writing. So at one point, I remember we're sitting around in a cafe, handing each other our poetry and then reading it and giving each other feedback, whether we liked it or not, and exchanging essays. Like I met Jelani Cobb because I had sent a paper that I wrote on hip hop to the editor of the anthology Testimony. He read it, and this is, 92, 93. And he wrote me this 8-page handwritten letter critiquing the paper. And I think that's an example of that Black studies ethic that was cultivated coming out of community spaces at the same time that it's coming out of intellectual spaces. So they were at Howard, they were getting that. And then I was in a Black studies space at Missouri and then in Kansas City and activist spaces. And I think that's one of those elements of the story of Black studies that can get lost if we aren't keeping in sight the history of Black studies coming out of political movements, and in particular coming out of Black power. I think there's a way that we can lose sight of the long history of Black intellectuals always engaged in these alternative spaces. And so our full entry into the academy is rather recent. And I think one of those benefits of that, there are a range of problems and benefits, I think, but one of the benefits of that is that we've developed a project collectively over the decades that is transformative, but it is really about making sure you understand what you're talking about. You're doing the work. So there's a certain demand for rigor. There's a demand that you are on top of your game and that you aren't, just about the market. And I think that is one of those things that comes out of that moment that, I don't know that anyone's ever written about it in those terms, but it is a very rich period, that the golden age of hip hop, but there's also the golden age of Black ideas and independent ideas that are outside the academy that, I think are reverberating within Black studies and the academy more generally in various ways.
Definitely. I think that it is something that's not as talked about or as acknowledged when we think about the trajectory of Black studies. And I would be very curious to know, just in general, where or who feels like those spaces are still, are they still there in places for people who are in both spaces? I think that it's definitely happening in communities, but I think that sometimes being in the academy separates you, whether it's just through the nature of time and the demands of being in the academy from those spaces. And what does that mean for where we're at now as a field in a discipline or area of study, however it's being conceptualized, and what's lost when we don't have that real deep-rooted back and forth with community.
Yeah, I mean, that is something that I think about a lot, particularly being the director of Africana studies here at Hopkins and being in a city like Baltimore. How does Black studies function kind of in these two spaces is what I hear you saying. And there is, there's certainly the long history of the connection that Black intellectuals had to the communities that they came out of or the communities where they were, whatever that connection may have been to them, they felt a responsibility. And I think on the whole, Black scholars probably feel a similar responsibility, or they want to have a similar connection. But as you pointed out, there are certain constraints that as we get more incorporated into the academy, as Black studies has become more formalized, the demands that makes on one are profound in ways you can't anticipate. And so how do you navigate that process? And so, I'm just thinking about, I'm one of the projects I'm at work on now is CLR James, when he returns to Trinidad for, West Indies Federation and becomes a part of Eric Williams' government in Trinidad. And before he leaves, and actually after that period, he is working with activists in Washington, D.C. at what was Federal City College, now is the University of D.C. And you have community organizers and academics who are developing a program in D.C. and they're petitioning the government for monies. This is coming from Congress to develop a community educational program. And then they just leave they leave Federal City College. They just move into the community and they don't worry about what's going on in the academy. But then you have someone like CLR James who never went to university and he's teaching at Federal City College and they bring him there because they recognize his intellectual and political importance. And that's something that I don't know that can happen in this moment. That was that moment, the dynamics of the 1960s and 70s. And I think now, as we're in the 2020s, and looking down the barrel of fascism are continuing along the lines of whatever we have right now, I think it's much more difficult to sustain that. And so we have to ask, and this is a question that I think Sylvia Winter posed really well in her essay, How We Mistook the Map for the Territory. What is it that we are seeing as the project of Black Studies? And then how do we adjust to this new environment? So excuse me, there are a range of things that we can say are useful and valuable with having a Black Studies department, with having a PhD program, with being able to tenure faculty in Black Studies, as opposed to only being able to work in the disciplines, and then you have to answer to the protocols of those disciplines. But at the same time, if you're a university institution, if you're a department, there are certain things you have to do. You have to abide by. There are certain things that you maybe can't do, or there are limits on how well you can do it. And then, people get older, they have families, time, they are making choices about the time that they spend. And that connection, I think, is probably not there anymore in the way that it was. I think in some instances you have it, where different programs are trying to maintain that connection. But I think overall, it's really not there. But that doesn't mean that what one is doing in Black Studies can still have that orientation in both the work that they do, the training that they do in terms of graduate students and undergraduates, the kinds of questions that they pose to people, but also the work that they do that's extra university. If you're doing public facing work, as it's called, if you're engaged in developing policy proposals or policy analysis, that's not to make policy out to be some panacea, but there are ways that one can still be engaged outside the university. And I think that's that's one of the advantages of Black Studies, is that it should still have the ability, or people, I think, understand it as being nimble enough, understand themselves as being nimble enough to try and adjust to this new environment. But that connection to community activists and organizations, it really isn't there. And even when you try it, the dynamic comes up of, I think now, and this has certainly been something that I've encountered in Baltimore, it's what do you bring to the table for a community organization, or a community like is a bookstore here, Everyone's Place in Baltimore. It's an amazing bookstore. And they have absolutely no need for Black Studies at Hopkins. They've been doing what they've been doing for over 30 years. So if we are to build a relationship with them, it has to be something that we bring that benefits them just as much as I might see the value of having that connection with that institution. So it's a much different dynamic all around. And I think that is one of the things that Black Studies scholars have to adjust to. And I don't know that we've adjusted that well. And the nature of the academy, people getting good jobs, summer vacations, all of that. It cuts into that. That cuts into the commitment that people have, or what people believe they can do in terms of their time commitments. And so, what other ways are you able to engage in these formations and maintain that tradition? I think it remains an open question, but it's definitely one that Black Studies has to pose to itself at this point.
Yeah, I agree. And even in thinking about not just the history of Black Studies, but also like the histories of these institutions that we're in, and the relationship of the institution to the surrounding community, and what that means to come in as well, can be very complicated and messy, and not at all untenuous. So,
right. Well, I mean, I've talked to different people who are from Baltimore, and I was shocked when I first got here and got a taxi, one of the few that you could find, I guess. And the person had no idea where Hopkins was at. He was like, okay, so where is this at? It never crossed the campus. It just wasn't a part of his world. Right. And I talked to a few friends who are in academia who are from Baltimore. And one was like, yeah, I went to Hopkins once for an SAT prep course. Or I went when there was a game on campus, a high school game on campus. But it just, Hopkins has this history of being very predatory on the Black community. And this is something that is as recent as the early 2000s. So as an institution, it's one that has really heavy baggage. And, Africana studies wasn't established until 2004. So when you have Black students taking over buildings, demanding Black studies courses, the hiring professors, Hopkins held out for a long time. They were, literally 30, 40 years behind the curve in many ways, and we're still catching up. But that's the nature of the institution that we're in. And I think Hopkins probably isn't unique in that regard, especially for private institutions. It probably is more par for the course. It's just that some of the stuff that we know about in terms of the medical testing and experimentation and treatment of Black residents and the displacement of Black residents is maybe a bit more dynamic and alarming than other places. But I've heard the same things happening across the board. So I think all these institutions are implicated in the treatment of Black communities, its predatory nature on Black people, and kind of the decline, the destruction really of community institutions. So, what does Black Studies mean when you're in that institution? How do you account for that? Mm-hmm. How do you move forward and try and invite people into an institution that for them, for a community, for parents and grandparents, they have that history. So you really can't just approach it as, okay, we're doing this and we want to connect. You really have to think about how you're connecting and then what you do. You definitely can't go. I don't think it was advisable at any point in time to go into a community like, we got the ideas, we got the knowledge, we got the truth, we have the solution. I think a lot of people do approach the community like that. And I think that's why, you have such a stark disconnect between Black academics and Black activists and community organizations.
Yeah, for sure. Because like pedagogy and teaching and all of that is not only like something I'm super interested in, but a part of my job. This past summer, I did training on civic engagement in the classroom and what it means to try to cultivate these relationships and to train students to be able to do work in partnership with communities in a way that, one, is not coming in like you're gonna save somebody who don't need to be saved and didn't ask for you to be here, but also like acknowledging and recognizing both that tension that might exist because of where you're coming from and the institution that you're representing, but really making sure it's something that the community would like to be engaged in, and respecting what it is they would like that relationship to be. And it's something that I think is so important to Black studies in general, and that I'm definitely thinking a lot more about as we consider what our curriculum for our department is moving forward. Like, what does that look like, and how do we help to encourage that for our students in ways that are respectful of both the community and the history of Black studies?
Right. And, I spent just under 10 years at Rutgers, and then I went to the University of Texas, and I was in the African and African Diaspora Studies program. And I think the University of Texas, as it's called now, is an example of Black studies that at its founding had a very clear orientation to activism that academics could do. So what was the responsibility of scholars in what then was only the John Warfield Center for African and African American Studies? What was their responsibility to Black life, to Black people, to Black communities that they were in and adjacent to? And so they published the Austin Manifesto, and this is leading up to them becoming a department. So I got there, I think, 2 years after it had departmentalized. And a lot of the structure of that graduate program and undergraduate program. So, you had to do a community engagement course as a senior capstone course at the same time that you were doing a senior seminar capstone course. And it was really trying to model that community engagement, that what you're doing, what you are learning can't just be disconnected from the world around you. It can't be knowledge for knowledge's sake. It has to have some larger responsibility. And I think initially, at least, that was also the vision of the graduate program. And all graduate programs probably have some bumps in the road as they get off the ground. And I think now it's humming along pretty well. But, what that looks like in terms of how graduate students are being trained to have that same orientation. And the work that a number of the graduates, some of whom I had in class, probably much to their chagrin, but some of the work that they're doing, I see now in different venues, and it's really amazing the kind of work that I see them doing. Both they are developing their scholarship, but they are modeling a certain form of the Black intellectual tradition where they are really concerned with speaking to broader communities, speaking to broader publics than just those who will read their work in an academic journal. And I think that's, if that becomes one model that we can consistently return to, then we have to look at other models and see what we can continue to develop to, I think, cultivate what you're saying, that civic engagement, that sense of it being a responsibility, of an ethic among undergraduates as well as graduates. And then the faculty as well. So, I think all of this is really important because it then, and this is again, something that, when I got to Texas, I had not struggled, but I kind of gotten a sense of what, this is what you do as a historian. And then I got a handle on how to do the kind of work that I wanted to do, the kind of scholarship that I wanted to do, and the kind of intellectual I wanted to be in a history department. But then when I got to Texas and I was in African and African diaspora studies, it was an environment that freed me from those constraints and allowed me to explore intellectually how I wanted to engage with colleagues who were coming from different disciplines, but had that same orientation. And, that was a moment for me where I think my work kind of came into its own. I was finally speaking to the people that I wanted to speak to. And I wasn't so concerned about speaking to historians. If, I'm trained as a historian, so if I speak to them, that's great. But if I don't, that's fine. And now I'm also in a history department here at Hopkins. And it's been fine, but I'm not as concerned about whether I'm doing history as such, or I'm doing history as it's understood by any particular group of historians. I'm really just doing my work. And it is that moment at Texas that really helped cultivate and foster that for me. And I think part of that, to get back to your point though, about that civic engagement, if we're thinking about what Black Studies does and what a lot of us take from the disciplines that we come from and what we bring into Black Studies as a project, if you're looking at, say, the period that I wrote on, the 1920s, and you're trying to understand how these people who were activists, who were intellectuals, who were community members and organizers, how they engaged with one another, how they thought about what was the challenge before them. People are trying to confront racism at a scale that we just can't understand. We can study it intellectually, but we don't know what that feels like. Colonialism at its height, there's no sign of it breaking by 1920. And they are thinking about, how do we foster world revolution? How do we change the world? But they're doing it in very mundane ways at times. And if you're really good at Black Studies, you're looking at what people are saying. You're observing how communities responded to different folks. And at least for me, what I try and do in the classroom is get across to the students that these were folks who were no older than them, early 20s at best. A lot of these people, maybe in their 30s. Some are still active, but they are organizing for revolution. They're organizing to change the entire social and economic structure of the U.S. South. They're trying to dismantle Jim Crow, which we might often think of as just a U.S. structure, but this is actually something that has a global resonance. And they are not educated. They aren't not educated in the sense that they haven't gone to college. They haven't gone to university by and large, but they're well read. They're smart. They know how to talk to one another. And that is that dynamic that I think we can bring out of what we do, out of our studies, out of the methodological training we do, that we're rooted in, and then try and translate that for our students to get them to think more dynamically about what they do. And then I think at the same time, maybe get us to think more dynamically about what we do and how we relate to people outside the academy, if that's the project, and if that's not the project, if one isn't engaged in community organizing, how can your scholarship, how can your work, how can what you do in the university still help in that larger goal? And so I would say, I don't think that everyone has to be a community activist or an activist intellectual or activist scholar or whatever. But I think there is within Black Studies a sense, or possibly even a demand, that you have that orientation. And some people are very well at pulling it off in terms of being involved in those community groups. Some people are doing other kinds of work. There are people who are doing amazing kind of archival work that is making connections with community members, making connections with a number of groups. But they're building an institution that functions in the service of Black Studies and in the service of Black people, even as it's housed in some of these institutions that have these very sordid histories with Black people.
There's so much that I want to follow up on.
But go ahead. We're having a conversation. Go ahead. Yeah.
One thing. So I'll start with the student aspect, right? And so as I stated, right, like pedagogy is super important to me. And that's
Mhm.
part of one, just my academic training, but also my interest, right? Like that's always been one of the most interesting things to me. It's like, what are we doing in the classroom and how do we learn things and how do we teach things and all of that. So what do you think, in keeping in line with this idea of like the different lanes that people have in Black studies and the different ways that you can approach um, living out the tradition and the goals of Black studies as a whole? What should, or what, I guess should, yeah. What should Black studies classrooms look like? What should they be doing that might be different than what you would find in maybe a more traditional history classroom or a more traditional English classroom?
Oh, that's a really good question. Um, and if I could, I would just rephrase it a little because
Oh,
I'm hesitant about being prescriptive
yeah.
that one should do this. That's why I was saying, I don't know that we should say that as a Black studies scholar or one who sees themselves in the Black intellectual tradition, one must be engaged in community organizing or community groups. However much I might wish that I was doing that, I'm not doing that on a regular routine basis. So um, I wouldn't want to be hypocritical, but also appreciate that people can have different kinds of approaches to that. But I think if the question is, what does Black studies, when done well, do differently than the traditional disciplines in the classroom or even in the work that we produce? I would fall back on something that an approach that I first heard articulated by Anthony Bogues, who's at Brown University, and it is really to think about the question that one is asking and having that guide then how you approach that question. And I say that because I think when I was in undergrad, but definitely in graduate school, and I found myself just being drawn to a range of work from outside of history as well as inside history. Um, one of the things that disciplines do is they develop, and now the traditional disciplines, they've developed and refined their methodologies to a degree that it can be opaque what they're doing if you aren't steeped in that methodology, right? And I think when you talk about the social sciences, it can be even more so. Like if one is doing quantitative research or qualitative research, what's the difference between those two? What are the methodological protocols? What are the demands of institutional review boards around the use of human subjects? All those things come into play in a way that make what a social scientist does as, say, a sociologist, a political scientist, radically different than what a literary scholar does or what a historian does. Even if we can talk to one another in a general way, we might lose sight of the fine grain of what we're both doing. And I think that if we are able to bring into the classroom an orientation that you have to push beyond simply what you are doing, the best way I think to do that is to say, not what is the methodology that you're using to approach this question. So I'm writing now about the limits of political imagination in Black political movement and how artistry offers a way out of the limitations that are inherent in political imaginaries. So if I'm approaching that and saying, okay, so I'm a historian, how do I approach that question with my methods? It shackles what I can do in addressing that question. But if I begin with the question, and the question is what's motivating, then I say, okay, so what are the methodological tools available in the world of academia, in the world of ideas, that I can draw on to approach that question. And in that sense, it may at times look like what a historian would do. But for the bulk of the work that I'm doing around this particular question, it doesn't look like history at all. There's like a historiographical essay. There's one piece that is kind of historical research, but by and large, it's not history. Um, and so I think that has to be the guiding. If I would be prescriptive, and I hesitate to be, but I would suggest that one might think about, what is the question that you're asking? What's the question that interests you? And then what does approaching that question require? And in that sense, I'm thinking about Lewis Gordon, the philosopher. And he had this point that, the best of Black studies is involved in this rigorous coordination of a range of methodologies, right? So you don't do it as a dilettante. You don't just take this little element from sociology, this little element from literature, this little element from political theory, this little element from history, and do none of it well. You do need to know what's involved in those various elements to do the Black Studies project really well. And that, I think, is really key. And I think that's something that's rooted in, when you think about it in those terms, it's something that's actually rooted in Black diasporic culture. If you think about hip hop and the loop and the breakbeat, if you were in the 70s, 80s, 90s, going to be a really great DJ, you had to know the range of music. You couldn't just know R&B. You had to know country music. You had to know pop. You had to know R&B. You had to know the British stuff, German electro. You had to know a range of things. Or I heard a story once of this jazz artist who was training someone, and the guy comes in and he's like, he's trained in all this classical music. And the teacher is like, all right, so you might be ready to begin to think about doing jazz because you've done all this stuff, but that's just, that's like the bricks and the mortar. Mm-hmm. You haven't put anything together. Now you have to start doing the work. And so I think that's part of what has to happen. At least I feel that's what the kind of approach that I want to take and that I try and get across to my graduate students is really focus on what you're asking, and then what do you need to do to really get at that. And at the undergraduate level, it's not as explicit as that, but I do just draw from across the board. So I have a course, Liberation in the African Diaspora, and it's designed as a survey course to introduce students to a range of questions, but really, how are Black people thinking about freedom? What does freedom mean in the context of being enslaved? What does liberation mean? Are these the same thing? Are there distinct differences? What does democracy mean? What does being a citizen mean? And how do the enslaved, how do those Black folks, a generation out of enslavement, and how do Black people who are engaging in liberation struggles, both against racial oppression, what some might call internal colonization, colonialism on the continent and in the Caribbean, how are they articulating all of these things? And often it isn't merely expanding the Western notions of freedom and democracy to include Black people, but it's a radical transformation of that. So to understand that, you can't just draw on one of those. You have to draw on a range. So, we'll read testimonies from the enslaved. We'll read documents from the Haitian Revolution. We'll read some Douglass. We'll read literature. There's a novel I teach about the Nigerian Biafran War. And this is kind of a post-colonial dilemma. What does freedom look like when the people who you see as oppressing you are actually Black? So what is Black power? Are we talking about just Black folks in power, running for the president, talking about the greatest thing in the world is to be an American, as I recently heard? Or are we talking about transforming the nature of power? And so, you have to do that in a way that gets students, I think, interested. You have to connect with them because they're very clear. They're very immediate. They're not going to read um,
Nah.
all of Angela Davis's work. They're not going to read Toni Morrison's essays. They're not going to read everything that Robin Kelley writes, and they're definitely not going to read my book. And then we talk about this. So you have to give them what you hope helps them approach these questions and think about them in a dynamic way. And then if they want to dive more into it, and I've been fortunate that a lot of the students I've encountered over the past 15 years have really wanted to dive into these questions. And it's really exciting to see them get excited about it and then what they do. But even if they aren't, you want to give them enough that they take it with them, and maybe it comes up later and they can still draw on it, but they aren't. I think it's a disservice to continue to do Black studies as if Black studies is the place where people who study Black people go, as opposed to Black studies is its own intellectual project. And methodology is maybe, it's maybe an easy and disingenuous terrain upon which to determine whether or not someone is doing Black studies or not. I think we have to talk about the questions that we're asking, how we approach those questions, and what we see as the goal of Black studies. And I think that's not going to be uniform. I think there's going to be a great deal of difference about that. And I think, for a number of people, they are very committed to their disciplines, and they do Black studies work, but they're still committed to their disciplines, and they want their work to be read in those disciplines, and they want to transform those disciplines, which we have to have that as well.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think we can say that the Black Studies Project means we abandon disciplines and disciplines just do what they want. Whether or not we're going to overhaul history or overhaul political science or overhaul English or comparative literature to do something that we would recognize as Black studies. No, but I think that people are in those disciplines and they are doing the work of making sure that they don't continue as they have. Philosophy, probably, economics, probably being two of the most change resistant disciplines out of the group. But that doesn't, I think that I would say that because of that, we also shouldn't see Black studies as a place where one is trained merely in a discipline with the title Black studies. One is actually training in Black studies, and you have to train as a Black studies scholar. And whatever you draw on, then I think that's great. And as a practical sense, people do want to get jobs if they're getting a PhD. So you have to make yourself intelligible to a discipline in some form or fashion. But at the same time, what is that commitment? What is that question you're asking? What's motivating the work? I think that's the most important part of Black studies. And too often, I think we aren't asking the questions of ourselves about how do our disciplines come into play in the Black Studies Project.
So now I have a whole entirely new question. But I'm
okay. All right.
I'm not gonna go too far down that lane. Two things. One of the things that I think is super interesting that I am party to, because my sister is working on her PhD at Johns Hopkins, is the space that's there in the history department. Like, it's such the number of Black studies scholars in history at Johns Hopkins is really, really interesting right now. And for it to be the oldest history department in the country, and for it to have this critical mass of people engaged in Black studies projects is so interesting to me. And we have a lot of conversations about that and what that means, not just for the work that she's trying to do, but for what the possibilities are for thinking about history in a different way. Because it is being, like, you have Black studies in the history department rather than being seen as a separate thing.
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, I would say that that's the reason why the transition from Black studies at Texas to being in the history department at Hopkins has been very easy for me because of the gathering of people working on the Black world, or the African diaspora in the history department. My colleague, Nathan Connolly, I think, pointed this out to me that we now have, and I may have this wrong, I think we now have the largest raw number of Black faculty working on Black people in any history department ever.
I would believe that.
Yeah. So when I got to Rutgers, that was 2004. I believe there were maybe 10 people working on Black people, the African continent, the US, Caribbean. But there were maybe 6 or 7 of us who were in the history department on faculty. And then by the time I went up for third year review, that number had maybe gone down by 4. So to come into a Black Studies department that was about 27 people, all but one of whom was Black, the one non-Black faculty, Chinese American, deep activist past, does amazing work. And then to come to this department. And I have to admit, when I interviewed, I was very concerned about what I was going to find, because Hopkins history department has a reputation as well. I have friends who had interviewed here, and some experience extreme hostility. Some, just didn't have a good experience. And I had a better experience than I anticipated having. But then when I got here and realized that I think there are, 9 of us, maybe 10, I can't, off the top of my head, I don't know the numbers exactly, but that we are able to do the work of training graduate students in a way that wouldn't have been possible 10 years ago. So if you look at Hopkins in 2014, I think there were less than there were less than, I didn't think this was going to come up, so I didn't look at the numbers, but I would have to say at maximum, there were like 10 Black people in the arts and sciences, period. That's maximum. And I may be too generous. I think it's about 5 people overall. And now in the history department alone, there are 9 of us, I believe. And there are a much larger number of people, Black people, doing work on Black subjects across the arts and sciences. But there's been a radical change over this 10-year period. And I think what one does or can do in the history department has changed radically as well. I've often heard people talk about being in history programs and being instructed that certain kinds of work or certain kinds of sources are not appropriate because they aren't housed in an archive, or they aren't a traditional historical source. And that wasn't an experience that I ever had. But in talking to people who've been here, faculty as well as students, I know that those kinds of things have been said, that, these aren't the sources you need to be engaging to do this as a historian, that kind of thing. A friend was just telling me that, not here, but at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, some of his friends were told that, quoting from Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa was not appropriate. And so they couldn't do it in their dissertation or in their coursework, right? I would be alarmed and stunned if that were to be said now. And I don't think it would stand up in the Hopkins history department more than the time it takes for someone to walk from that office where it was said to the office of one of us. And this is what I'm being told, because the culture, the sense of what is an appropriate historical question, what are sources? I think that that's changed tremendously in this department. At the same time that I think it still has its demands and its expectations on students and the faculty. So the work, and this is, the lie to so much of what has been told about Black studies and Black scholars, the work is no less rigorous, but what one is able to do and how one is able to expand their horizons doing a historical dissertation is much different now. And I think a number of us do draw on other disciplines, do draw on a range of other materials, not strictly history. I think I maybe do it a bit more than some of my colleagues, but I'm definitely not a unicorn in that sense. In this department, I'm kind of par for the course. I just maybe engage political theory and critical theory a bit more explicitly and on the front end, but by no means am I the only one engaging theory among our faculty. And so I kind of fit in with the program, and I'm not an outlier and by any sense. And so I think the work that your sister is able to do, Jessica Newby, shout her out, a historian who will be doing some great work. Everyone keep your eyes out for her. I think the work that she's able to do and some of the other graduate students are able to do is really benefiting from this changed environment. But again, this is only within a 10-year period.
Yeah.
It's not a long standing transformation. And I think, my colleague, Nathan Connolly, a lot of that transformation is the result of the work that he's done in the history department and pushing these questions, pushing his colleagues, navigating a complex institutional terrain to make sure that this is now a place that someone like myself, can come in. And I still might have a difficult time saying exactly what historians do or what's the most important historical debates of the day. But I can come in and still operate and function. I think it has been a sea change in terms of the culture and the intellectual orientation. But again, that is Black studies within a history department. And so I think it looks a particular way, and it has to have a fidelity to the protocols of the historical profession. I would still push to tell a historian, begin with the question. Don't begin with the archives, which is, a no-no for a historian. But I would say don't begin with the archives. Have your question. Have a sense of what you want to say. And then read everything that you can so that you can know or have a good sense, a good idea of what you might need to draw on. And then when you get in the archives will help you understand whether or not everything you wanted to say is possible to say. If you want to know exactly what someone was thinking in rural Mississippi when they first heard Black Power, or what someone was thinking in Port of Spain, Trinidad in 1960 when they hear C.L.R. James give a talk, or in the 1970s when Amilcar Cabral is leading a campaign against the Portuguese. You may not necessarily be able to say what exactly someone was thinking. Maybe you can. But if you're drawing on a range of material, you have a good idea of what people were thinking. And so then you're trying to find the sources, and not only what's in our archive and the physical building of an archive, but you're looking at a range of sources. You might look at literature. You might look at film. You might look at, you might do some more anthropological work and get a sense of the stories that people were handing down about these events and these periods of what folks were doing, how they were responding. You might listen to the music and call from that a sense of the history that's there. So I think these are all the kinds of things that one can do with Black studies, even if you're doing Black studies in a history department or doing it in a department. And so my hope is that at Hopkins, at least, we can build on that energy out of the Black World Group in the history department, as well as the gathering of people in literature and sociology and political science, much smaller gathering than in history, to build Africana studies into a department of Black study that can really pursue these questions and pursue this intellectual project with some fidelity to the history and tradition of Black studies, however limited that may be, but nonetheless, that being a goal, particularly in a city like Baltimore, a resolutely Black city that is an amazing, interesting place to be in. And, that's what I hope this history department, the example that it's set at the university, allows for the institution to see, which then has the benefit of allowing us in Black study to do what we want to do. And the institution is kind of primed to accept, okay, this is legitimate because we've seen it done in one instance, and then we can expand that and build on that tradition in a different instance.
Thank you. That, again, now, all of the things, all of the thoughts. But I want to make sure, I'm going to skip a couple of questions in the interest of time, because I want to hear more about the work that's happening in the Center for Africana Studies, and like, what's happening there, and how does that fit within your intellectual and academic trajectory project, the questions that you are most interested in asking?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I came to Hopkins in 2021 as director of the Center for Africana Studies. And the center, again, was established in 2004. Its initial director was Ben Vincent, who's now the president of Howard University. And after he left, I can't remember the exact date or how one would gauge it, but about the middle of the last decade, Africana Studies took a decided downturn. There were some leadership choices that the university had made in terms of who they appointed to direct Black studies. One in particular, who I'll not name, but from everything that I've seen in every account, was disastrous for Africana studies. And I think that really chipped away at the enthusiasm that people had for the project. And that probably is part of the reason why so much energy went into building the Black World faculty in the history department, because Africana studies just would not be that institutional space. So initially, when I came in, I wanted to just try and help build up this sense of intellectual and social community, a sense of conviviality among the faculty on campus who are centered in various ways around Africana studies. And then there was a change in administration as I was coming in the door, and they were much more receptive to the ideas that I had about building Africana into a department, and that department having as its orientation, its standard, what is Black studies, so that we'll be a department. The proposal is we'll be the Department of Black Study. We're in the process. I think the final phases of that process are departmentalizing now. We've been able to get money from a cluster hire initiative on campus to hire faculty to come into this, but now come into the center, but ultimately help build up a department. And eventually we'll have a graduate program. But the goal, I guess the approach that I've had, is to try and build as best as possible connections with people in the community. And that's been uneven, but, we have built some relationships with folks who work in food sovereignty, not as sustained as I would like, but nonetheless, we have some relationship with them. We know who they are. They know who we are. We've made connections with people in community organizations, some who actually come out of Hopkins. And so trying to see about, particularly this year, bringing people back to campus to talk about the election, things like that. So the orientation is to have a department that insists on the academic side of Black Studies and being as capacious and audacious as Black Studies was at its founding, and really its fundamental challenge to transform knowledge production overall, and to not see knowledge production as something that is unconnected from political and social struggle, but then to also build in ways that aren't predatory, that aren't exploitative, and that aren't condescending, to build relationships with folks in the community. And again, it requires, all of this requires a lot of work. I think once we are a department and people have appointments in Black Studies and their time can be institutionally devoted to that, I think hopefully we'll see a lot more fruits of those efforts to build ties with the community. But I think ultimately it will be what we're able to build as a department, the kind of educational program. So the School of Public Health has a lot of students here and they want to take our classes. There is a class offered by two of our affiliates, Robbie Shilliam and Sasha White, on Africana Studies meets Public Health, and the work that they have undergraduates doing in terms of researching questions of public health, questions of space, the relationship of Hopkins to West and East Baltimore. It's some great work. And whether or not they go on to get PhDs or masters, or even if they don't even get a minor in Africana Studies, I'm pretty confident that kind of work will resonate in their work in the public health realm, public policy realm. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we are hoping to build on. At the same time that, we are also probably unique in that we have a relatively good balance between scholars coming out of the humanities and coming out of the social sciences and being in conversation together, and the kind of project that can evolve from that, I think might more closely resemble those early Black Studies programs and departments, in ways that, there's definitely at least the more popular, the more brand recognizable Black Studies program and department around the country tend to be largely in the humanities. And I don't have any truck in whether or not one is more humanities or social sciences. But I think if we are able to build those two together and draw on those in a way that makes little claim about, or has little concern of whether or not it's the humanities or social sciences, but we have a whole wealth of resources that we can draw on in our work and in our training, I think that will be one of the distinctive things about Black Study at Hopkins. And, hopefully that what we put together will sustain over the long haul. But, these are institutions, academic institutions. And I think it's always important that when we're building these institutions, we don't have a sense of ownership that it can't go in a different direction, whatever we may think of that direction. So that's the goal, is to hopefully build up something that has a solid foundation and then watch it move forward, and take shape and have a dynamic leadership, a dynamic faculty that can really draw in and attract students who want to do some interesting, amazing work. And I think, the students that we're attracting so far at Hopkins, they're pretty amazing. They're energetic, they're innovative, and I think this is the kind of thing that can serve them well.
Thank you. I'm really excited to see what happens over the next several years.
Thank you. Thank you.
Because that sounds, again, now there are all other kinds of questions about adherence to humanities and social sciences and all these other questions that
Right. Yeah.
That you have been so generous with your time. So I don't want to take up too much more of it. I just wanted to ask, is there anything else you would like to add about Black studies in this moment?
Yeah, I would, and this is in part because I'm engaged in this. But I would just say that I think as we think about Black studies, it's important not to just focus on intellectual fads and brands, as it were. I think people are concerned about careers, and then in that sense, the academy, as a college education is seen as a way to get a decent job. It isn't overall seen as a space where one engages in a life of the mind. And it just is what it is, the nature of the world at this point. But I think Black studies can still pursue that project. But I think we also have to recognize that we also might need to do that in ways that aren't just about the academy, that there are a range of forms that can take, both that are tied to the institutions that we're in and that exist outside of them. And so I'm a part of a group of largely political theorists and historians, and we've called this the Black Politics History Theory Workshop. And this is something that emerged organically. It was a group of us who wanted to do some work. Originally, it was a conference panel that would interrogate the challenge that Ferguson and Black Lives Matter, what were the challenges that it presented to Black politics, broadly conceived. And then that developed into a special issue of South Atlantic Quarterly that looked at Ferguson and Baltimore with the killing of Freddie Gray, what this meant for Black politics, the challenges it entailed. And so that was our effort to try and understand that. And that gathering of people, and it was, I think, originally called Black Politics History Theory because it was theorists and historians concerned about politics. And we've continued in different ways that workshop, and we've developed a network to support one another's work, to support the work of others. We, in different ways, are trying to involve graduate students in that. And it isn't something that has firm institutional footing in any one institution. So the people who participate in this are at Hopkins, Northwestern, Brown, Vanderbilt. Now one of the members who've been a constant presence is at Rice, University of Washington. So we're all over, and we're trying to build this space that is not tethered to any one of those institutions, but can hopefully draw on those resources to address these questions that we see as pertinent and immediate to the concerns that Black people have, the concerns that we have around the world. So there's not just in the U.S., but it really is a global project. And I think, the work that has come out of that. So there's been a second issue of South Atlantic Quarterly dealt with the Black Summer of 2020 and the pandemic. A number of books have developed out of the workshop. And I think, some of the most exciting work that I've been able to do and exciting conversations I've had over the past 6 years have been in this workshop. And, we aren't necessarily asking the question of shedding the disciplines and doing Black studies, but I think it's indicative of that project that I'd imagine we aren't unique necessarily in what we're doing. I think people are doing it in different kinds of ways, but I think it is unique that we've been able to sustain this. I guess that was 2015 or 2016 was when we first did a panel at the Western Political Science Association, which is a political theory heavy conference. And we just had our most recent workshop in Cartagena, Colombia, and visited Palenque, which is the oldest Black free town in the Americas. And it's in that context that we're workshopping our work and giving one another feedback and thinking about what this means, and challenging one another in constructive ways to really push our work. So I think that that's also an avenue that we can take to pursue Black study, that it doesn't have to be formally within academy, but we can do it on our own and tie it to our academies in ways that are beneficial to us as opposed to in ways that put demands on us or the institution.
Thank you. That is a wonderful new way to think about this, right? Like, it's important for us to continue to be creative in the ways that this work happens, in ways that can push the work forward, but allow us to live our lives and for that work to be sustainable. So that's a really great place to end. Thank you so much for all of your time and conversation. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and now I have even more questions swimming in my mind to go and think about.
Thank you so much again for the invitation, and you're right down the road. Maybe literally, I don't know where exactly you live, but so maybe we'll have a chance to continue the conversation. But thank you for the invitation to be on the podcast. It's a really great project, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
You as well.